House of the Dragon Season 2 Episode 8. It's a mixed bag for me. There's a lot to like here. There's also a lot I have doubts about, as well as a question I want to raise about the identity of this show as a whole. First, I want to discuss Rhaenyra though, and also, if we have a theme this episode, I think it's just dragons in themselves and everything they symbolise. We get a lot of dragons this episode, and a lot of what dragons mean and what they are imbued with, especially this idea of something divine that is now under threat. If dragons are godlike, but they can be killed and marched through a street, or low-born people can claim them, are they really so divine? Are they in fact not part of a power structure that we could bring down? I really like Rhaenyra's arc this episode. To begin with, I wasn't sure because her pretty civil meeting with Adam feels like a step back from the impulsive eagerness with which she flew out last episode, all pumped up on ideas of taking action and being like Daemon, and then to not see much fire from her in that meeting. However, Adam is offering Rhaenyra absolutely everything she's been looking for. Validation. Proof that her, or I suppose Jace's plan to find more dragon riders is a good one. We can find more people, we can amass more riders, and then we can win this war. I was right. You know, we saw last episode how Lord Bardamus thought trying to give Sir Stefan a dragon was folly, and she didn't like hearing that. She slapped him. Adam comes at the perfect time to bolster Rhaenyra's righteousness and the sense that all my counsel are wrong, I'm making good decisions, I know what I'm doing here. Which is compelling because, in a way, she's right. To faintly paraphrase Season 7 Jon Snow,
but more importantly, we need
more dragon riders. But military-wise, the Blacks are in the weaker position. However, Sunfire is either heavily injured or dead. Daemon looks to finally be amassing an army, and now Rhaenyra has assembled the Avengers. There is a strong argument to say this is the right thing to do, despite the obvious risks, if she wants to win this war. And I agree there. I think if that's what you're aiming for, there aren't any answers without complications. I think this answer is the least bad. Not that we shouldn't feel dread about where this might be going, and Rhaenyra's execution of that decision I think is what we can question, because she actively chooses to avoid her council now, likely because she knows how much they will protest at what she is doing, call it ridiculous and stupid, probably talk again about how they need Daemon rather than other random people flying dragons. Rhaenyra doesn't want to hear that. Instead, she's shutting herself away with just Mysaria, and that is obviously dangerous. I wondered before if Mysaria's praise of Rhaenyra was sincere or part of a manipulation. We still don't know what Mysaria's perspective is on that kiss. I hope we do find out, because I think that's important. But for Rhaenyra, it was a moment of acceptance and validation, a feeling that someone understands her, and it feds the righteousness and the restless desire to take action and be like Daemon. And we could wonder about the fact Mysaria was just talking about experiences of SA before this. In my mind, that scene was a very ominous one, with very foreboding music reflecting the dangers of who Rhaenyra might be becoming. So let's add it all up. She's choosing to ignore her council because she doesn't like what they say, and she doesn't like being told how important Daemon is when she wants to feel capable in her own right. She wants some agency. She's also upset Jace now, who did want to find more dragon riders, but he meant people from highborn families. The way he describes the dragon seeds as mongrels here, I think has a level of projection to do with it, especially because it puts his own legitimacy at threat. Last time these two characters had a disagreement, they resolved it and came together with affection, but this time, I'm not sure. And then she's also upset her dragon keepers who now walk out on her. But I also have to wonder what the other High Lords will think about Adam, Ulf and Hugh. Jane Arryn didn't get a grown dragon when she asked for one, but these people do. The Freys, all the other supporters, you know, Rhaenyra is upsetting the order of things in a way that a lot of people might not like. Even just the idea of an army of bastards, as she puts it. Is that something that people will like? Maybe? Or is that something that can be used as propaganda against her? We're seeing Rhaenyra lose some of the strong connections she's had and gradually isolate herself, whilst also again becoming more righteous. This episode she's now outright talking about the will of the gods. Adam being given a dragon is a sign from the gods that she must take up. She gives a speech to the dragon seeds about the gods, and I really like that scene because it gives me faint sort of cult vibes.
Rhaenyra to go and like walk amongst the seas as though a pastor amongst her flock in the terms of a religious cult.
All this talk about how they have to risk death and take this great sacrifice to potentially spare the world from bloodshed. Emma D'Arcy delivers it so perfectly to make it all sound quite logical and straightforward. And I have a lot of empathy for Rhaenyra, but is this logical? Her counsellors would be calling all of this absolute madness were she not avoiding them. And what we watch is then absolute madness, with unnecessary deaths that the younger Rhaenyra probably would have felt bad about. But here we see her looking down from the platform above with an expression of validation and righteousness, and maybe even something slightly fanatical. All of that horrible fiery death was worth it, because we've got 2 dragon riders here. I was right. I find that shot wonderfully foreboding. You know, I don't personally think Rhaenyra ever really cared about the A Song of Ice and Fire prophecy. As ever, I don't like that plot point, but she never showed much interest in it until suddenly she realised it is good justification for her claim for the throne. But now we're seeing that's up another level with her sudden invigorated interest in the gods here. This is all good stuff to add to an organic motivation for Rhaenyra, an organic growth, or rather descent into her becoming more brutal, righteous. Rhaenyra finishes this episode more blinkered in her view, more politically isolated, but also with a load more firepower, kind of taunting Aemond, itching for a fight despite earlier talking about peace and avoiding bloodshed. It's very hard to write a story of someone descending into, I suppose you'd say villainy, but that makes it sound like the Greens are the good side. Neither of them are. I don't think it's as simple as heroes and villains anyway. But you know, it's very hard to write that kind of arc in a way where you still feel empathy for the character and can almost be tricked into supporting her. I think they're pulling that off here. Not flawlessly, but pretty well. Also, with how very close by this episode makes Dragonstone and King's Landing look, I can only wonder, are we gearing up for an attack on King's Landing? Is that where this is heading? The final shot makes Rhaenyra look very keen to demonstrate her new firepower. If so, that would make for a great finale to the season. However, I do have concerns that I want to discuss now after this.
I have sweated blood in service
World building.
And if the gods call me to
51% off.
Who am I to refuse them?
World Anvil. Yep, they sponsored this video, they're still here, hopefully they'll stay here. World Anvil is an online tool for building worlds, creating characters, designing and managing campaigns for a whole slew of games. Sleuth isn't the right word, I don't know why I said that. Look, you can do all that, you can plan and write stories, you can do all sorts of different stuff for creative projects. I use it for the world building of my novel because my old system of massive Word documents became far too chaotic. Not only does the ability to create timelines with hyperlinks branching off to specific characters or articles or a billion other things, not only does that make it so much easier to quickly find the information I need, it also makes it so much easier to plan things out and kind of keep going. Sometimes a blank Word document for world building is very daunting, so having all sorts of tools to help with visualization, to help you figure out what needs planning next, to keep your brain fizzing and unimpeded, because all of the tools are very straightforward and easy to use. That's really important to me. It's like the sharper an artist's pencils, the freer they are to focus on the art. World Anvil is a very sharp pencil. You can create mind maps, you can rearrange elements of your story, do all sorts of campaign related things for that slew of games I mentioned. Yes, link in the description and as a pinned comment should you desire a 51% discount on all their subscriptions, or if you're not yet sure, then try out the free version for as long as you like. That's what I did at first, and now look where I am, shouting their name at you through a screen. World Anvil! So, I'm going to be honest, as opposed to lying through my teeth. There was a lot this episode I didn't quite buy. For example, Hugh claiming Vermithor. I really like the idea behind that, saving someone else, goading Vermithor in that adrenaline-fueled, angered state, but I just didn't feel enough anger from him. Come on! Hugh is a character who has had a lot of underlying anger, but it's always felt too restrained in the performance for my liking. You know, this episode makes it absolutely clear his daughter died essentially because Aegon never came good on his promise, and I think I would like to see Hugh absolutely furious. and then taking this mad chance for power and an escape from poverty and possible revenge, and then it all turning into this chaos and then having to face down his own possible death. The performance just wasn't mad enough for me, filled enough adrenaline. I don't know, it also reaffirms the fact we've never quite been given enough to emotionally invest in these Dragon Seed characters. For me, that's one part of why, as great as this dragon claiming scene is on paper, it doesn't quite convince me. You know, either you do this in a way where we don't really know any of these Dragon Seeds, and we're tense because we don't know if anyone is going to live or who will claim these dragons. That's not a tension we can really do in the show, because Hugh and Ulf have both been hinted loads to have big story significance, so we just know from the beginning that they're the ones who are going to come away as dragon riders. It's obvious. Or alternatively, you lean into their characters, have us really invested in them, so that even though it's pretty obvious they're going to get the dragons, by the time we get to this, we're really willing them on, we're eager to see them triumph. But I feel like I don't think there's ever quite been enough to invest in them. The scene is very well filmed and choreographed, but I don't care enough about Hugh. And that's really weird. He lost his daughter, we've seen this man fighting for food in the streets. I should care. Why don't I? Is it just me? Maybe it's just me. Tell me what you think. The second more important point in my mind is the absurdity of House of the Dragon. The story is ultimately a tragedy about how the House of the Dragon destroyed itself and completely tore apart a kingdom of innocent people over a war that did not have to happen. It is very tragic, but there is also something quite absurd in that. Realistic, but nonetheless, you know, the absurdity of human nature, the absolute awful carnage that those in power can unleash upon everyone, including themselves, and how a lot of the time all of this sophisticated politicking is riddled with petty grudges and childish thinking. It is kind of ridiculous. That was part of what was so fun and also very sad about season 1, how ridiculous and exhausting all of these family feuds seemed to Viserys and how incapable he was to prevent them. At its best, I think this show has very, very subtle shades of a dark satire. We saw that really come to life in episode 2 this season. I found that episode so fun in particular. We've seen all sorts of glimpses of ridiculousness from the Brackens and Blackwoods. We've seen Daemon charging through Harrenhal looking for a fight, only to be offered venison by Simon Strong. Also Simon saying, "Oh dear," is my favourite line this episode. I don't think I picked the best examples there, but the problem for me is how uncertain this show is about whether it wants to be a straight out tragedy or a dark satire. There is definitely a balance to be found between the two of them, but it feels to me like House of the Dragon is never quite sure where that balance is. I mentioned last episode how I felt they played it very straight and serious when Rhaenyra sent food to feed and manipulate the people her blockade was causing to starve. You know, of course starving people aren't going to question the food they're being given, of course they're just going to take it and fight for it, but there is nonetheless something quite absurd about how easy it is to manipulate them there, and how hypocritical it is, and how getting so very caught up in which dragon-wielding ruler would care for you the most is so not the important question. But they played it all very seriously, and I actually found that made the dialogue between Ulf and the Madam less convincing for me personally. And this episode, again, it makes total sense. I can buy this as a realistic plot point. I'm not saying it's unrealistic, but I am saying there is still also something kind of ridiculous about Rhaenyra putting the call out for people to come and claim a dragon. I just can't help thinking of Willy Wonka and his golden tickets. And I think they could have lent into some of the absurdity of that here. How odd and out of the blue this idea is when dragons have been seen as gods. Is this serious? Are we getting a load of drunk people going, yeah, I'll give that a punt, my hair's a bit white, ain't it? Why not? Or are we seeing Rhaenyra's council speechless about this idea? Maybe Corlys, we've seen him do next to nothing since becoming Hand of the Queen. Do the Greens know about this idea? You know, Linda seems to be spreading the news discreetly, and yet all of the public also seems to know about this, so are the Greens aware? If not, why? If so, are they shocked at this idea? Do they find it funny? Are they happy to let Rhaenyra go ahead with it? If not, how are these people getting out of a city that Aemon closed? I think when you play it so very straight, with a dramatic montage of Alinda and Alyn that kind of makes it look cool, suddenly all of the problems with this plan feel more like plot holes than fun, natural absurdities. And in that sense, I think the lack of absurdity is actually why a lot of people are misunderstanding Rhaenyra this season. You know, I really like the slow descent in her arc, but I feel like this is also part of why so many people do completely misunderstand her character in the show. Because they do so rarely lean into her absurdity for subtle humour. I can fully understand why people watch her slap Lord Bartimos and mistake it for a good thing. Why people see her pick up a sword and then they start ranting about girl boss ideas, that's a phrase everybody always seems to use, rather than see it as a worrying sign of Rhaenyra starting to again look at Daemon as a role model for ruling rather than Viserys. The cult-like scene of her talking to her flock this episode could have been peppered with subtle absurdity much more than it is. Mostly it's all very serious. And then on the flip side, you get Ulf, where it feels almost like he walked out of a Dickens novel or something. I really like Ulf. I like his friends ripping into him for all his boasting about his bloodline, and I like the idea of him possibly flying over King's Landing as a shout out to his homies. But tonally, it doesn't quite gel for me with how serious and brooding the rest of this is being played. We're cutting from Hugh, who is supposed to be pumped up on anger and adrenaline, who has lost his daughter and is goading for death, to then Ulf, stumbling around and bumping into Silverwing, who greets him like some lonely old lady just happy to have someone come visit for tea. So for me, House of the Dragon never quite feels sure how much this is a very bleak, brooding Shakespearean tragedy, and how much this is a dark satire on the absurdity of war and human conflict. There are times where it finds the balance really, really well, especially episode 2 this season. But there are also other times where the tonal shift is a little jarring, or where everything becomes too dour and too drenched in its own tragedy. A lot of the time it works great, but I also feel like 2 seasons in is too late to still be trying to find the right balance. But I don't know, this isn't an idea I've heard anyone else talk about in relation to the show. It might just be me. I don't know if anyone else does see it like a satire. Maybe that whole section is a load of waffle, but I'm really curious to see what other people think there. As I say, I like a lot of the ideas behind this episode, and I love where Rhaenyra finishes up. My problems are less to do with the ideas than the execution, I think, than anything else. But what else do I want to talk about today? I try and keep this quick because I've already talked loads and my voice is starting to go. Oscar Tully is great this episode. He is young, he needs to prove himself to a bunch of lords who think he's just a kid being played by Daemon. Faintly insulting Daemon is absolutely the best way for him to find the support of his people, to prove he's not just some weak-willed child. And Daemon has no choice but to take the insults, even if he finds himself slightly derailed down a path he didn't want to tread here. I think it's a strong scene, and it feels like a really organic moment of Daemon realising, oh, you can't just assert strength and do what you think is right, you also have to be diplomatic at times. Ruling is confusing and messy. Why, yes it is, Daemon. I feel they presented his arc this episode clearly and succinctly through that scene with Oscar, and actually the dream sequence made it far too obvious for my liking. I quite liked the dream we saw depicted, but I also feel it's better cutting that scene. Something to enjoy as a deleted scene probably, rather than something you need in the episode. I also like what they've done with Alicent here. I talked about pressure building for her and what it might lead her into doing. Rather than snap with a fury or a renewed sense of purpose, we see all the fight go out of her here. I find that really compelling and relatable. Is she looking to end her life here? Is this an act of trying to cleanse sin? Where is it going to lead to next? I think it's a really strong idea in itself. However, I'm just a bit concerned that we now have 1 episode left of the season. Alicent's arc kind of ends halfway through this episode, and I'm wondering if there's going to be enough time to convincingly wrap everything up in the final season, you know? We didn't see Kristen at all this time, we've not seen Otto for ages. what the hell has he been up to? Darragh needs to appear. They can't allude to him so much and not show him. Where is Aegon going to finish this season? Rhaenyra, is she going to turn ruthless, or are they going to wait a whole extra season before they see that? How are people going to react to the new dragon riders? That could cause a big shake-up. Again, all of these ideas about what if the dragons aren't gods. That's a big thing that needs to reach some kind of conclusion. The big one for me is, what about the riots in King's Landing? Because episode 6 was really building up the idea of that. I was expecting Aemons to now retaliate and make it 10 times worse, but a lot of that palpable underlying tension, that powder keg I talked about before, that kind of gets put on hold this episode. Is that going to suddenly reignite again in the next episode, but also can they fit a battle in as well? It's not just that there's a lot to wrap up in one episode, but it's also, story-wise, we need a sense of momentum. I was so excited for that last episode. I felt like things were starting to now just subtly build into a big race towards a climax, but we don't get that here exactly. We feel like things are moving into place for a conclusion, but not like there's this race, this big sense of drive developing. So I think in that sense we're going to have to get something spectacular next episode to pull everything together, or else I'm going to question why they didn't go for the typical 10 episode format. I hope I'm going to be proven wrong, but right now 8 episodes feels too short for this season. Either way, this episode is still a 7 for me. There is a lot to love here. I haven't talked too much about the positives, but I also don't think I've needed to exactly. I do find it a little hesitant to lean into the humour here. I find it to be unconvincing with Hugh and Alan and Ulf as characters, and yeah, lacking in the momentum that a penultimate episode of the season should have. It's still a good episode, but that's why I would score it 7. But yeah, what do you think? Am I talking nonsense? This is the video where I think I most feel like I might be talking nonsense out of any of them. Comment your thoughts, like the video if you liked it, subscribe, maybe even support me on Patreon or buy me a coffee. Otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Flying Spider, Grace, Kellyanne Davidson, Luke Hoare, Michael Gallagher, Chad Bramwell and Joshua C. Follier. Thank you.